Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Winter has come to the mountain once again, but instead of being snowed in on the mountain pasture and unable to go anywhere, Heidi and Grandfather have moved to the Hamlet. In the little town of Dörfli, Heidi goes to school, teaches the reluctant Peter how to read, and enjoys the snow-filled winter. Every day continues to bring something new and wonderful to her life. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Heidi, Chapter 18. Winter in the Hamlet. On the mountain meadow, the snow lay so deep around the hut that it looked as though the windows were standing on the level of the ground, for beneath them not a bit of the cottage walls was to be seen, and even the entrance door had entirely disappeared. If Meadow Nuncle had been living up there, he would have had to do the same thing Peter did every day when, as usual, there had been a fresh snow the night before. Each morning the goatherd was forced to jump out the window of his room, and if it had not been cold enough during the night to form a stiff crust, he sank down almost over his head in the soft snow. Often Peter had to struggle and strike out around him with his hands, and his head and feet, in order to work his way out to freedom. Then his mother would hand him the big broom out of the window, and with this, Peter would push and scrape the snow in front of him until he had come to the door. Nor was that the last of his task, for when he came to the door, all the snow had to be dug away, for you see, the snow was either still soft, and so when the door was opened it would fall bodily into the kitchen, or it was frozen solid, and in that case they were completely walled in. And then no one could force his way through the cliff of ice, and of the three who lived in the hut, only Peter was the one small enough to slip out through the little window. Peter rather liked the weather when the things froze hard. If he was bound for Dörfli, all he had to do was open the window, crawl through it, and stand on the level surface of the firm field of snow. Then his mother would shove his small sled through the window after him, and Peter could sit on that and start off wherever he wanted to go. For however he might go, he slid downhill just the same, because the whole pasture land was nothing but a great continuous path of ice. Nuncle had been as good as his word, and was not living on the mountain meadow that winter. As soon as the first fall of snow had come, he closed the hut and the stable, and together with Heidi and the goats, moved down to the hamlet. There, near the church and the parsonage, stood a large, roomy building. In olden days, this had been a fine piece of property, as might still be seen in many places, though the mansion was now more or less in a state of ruin. A brave soldier had lived in it once upon a time. He had fought in the Spanish wars and done many courageous deeds, and returned with a great deal of money. He had come back to his native village Dörfli, and with his riches he had built himself a splendid house, for here he wished to end his days. But after all he did not stay long. Life in the quiet Dörfli was too slow for him, and he had lived too many years in the noisy world to endure such peace. So off he marched again one day, and never was seen afterward. Many years came and went before it was surely known that the soldier was dead, and then a distant relative from down in the valley moved into the mansion. But by that time it had already begun to fall to pieces, and the new owner did not care enough for his property to repair it. So poor people rented the house for next to nothing, and when a part of the building would fall off, they let it lie wherever it struck the ground. Since that time many years again passed by, and when Nuncle brought his young son Tobias back to Dörfli, he rented the ruined house and lived in it. But since those long-forgotten days, it had stood empty most of the time, for no one could possibly live in the place unless he knew how to keep the house from further ruin, and unless he could at least to some extent stop up the holes and gaps in its walls. For winters up in the hamlet were long and cold. The winds blew and blustered through the rooms from all directions, so that the candles were put out, and the poor people who used to rent the house had shivered with cold. But Nuncle knew how to put an end to that. The moment he had decided to spend the winter in Dörfli, he rented the old mansion again, and often during the autumn had been coming down to the village to repair it whenever he had a few moments to spare. And, about the middle of October, he and Heidi had moved down. If you entered the house the back way, you came at once to an open room. One of its walls had quite fallen in, and the other was half gone. Above this space a bay window was still to be seen, but its glass had long been broken, and matted ivy twined around it, climbing up to the roof, which was, in great part, still solid. This rear apartment was beautifully arched, and there was no doubt but that it had once been a chapel. From this an opening, the door of which was lost, led directly into a large hall. Here and there handsome tiles were still remaining in the floor, but between them thick grass was growing. In this place, too, the walls were half fallen, and great pieces of the roof were missing. In fact, if two huge pillars had not still held up parts of the ceiling, one would have expected it to fall down at any moment upon the heads of those who stood beneath it. Here Nuncle put up a partition of boards, and had covered the floor thickly with straw, for the goats were going to lodge in this old hall. Then there were all kinds of corridors, always half open to the weather, so that from one you could look straight at the sky, from another at the meadows and the path outside. But in the front part of the house, where the heavy oak door still hung firmly on its hinges, there was a large room, which was in good repair. Its four walls were still upright, its dark panels of wood unbroken, and in one corner stood a monstrous stove that reached almost to the ceiling, and on its white glazed tiles big blue pictures were painted. There were pictures on the tiles of old castles set on the heights, flanked by tall trees, and down below a huntsman was walking with his dogs. Then again there were scenes of a peaceful lake under wide-spreading oak trees, with a fisherman standing on the bank and holding his rod far out over the water. All about the stove was built a bench, so that one might sit down and study the pictures close at hand. Heidi fell in love with this spot at first sight. The very moment she entered the living room with her grandfather, she had run to the stove, sat down on the bench, and begun to gaze at the pictures. But when she had slipped along the bench until she was behind the stove, something new happened to attract her whole attention. In the fairly large space between the stove and the wall, 4 boards had been set up, as if to form a bin for apples. But there were no apples in the bin. In their place stood Heidi's bed, unmistakably put together, just as it had been up on the mountain meadow. A high couch of hay with the linen sheet and the sack to cover it. Heidi cried aloud, "Oh, Grandfather, here's my bedroom, and it's beautiful. But where are you going to sleep?" "Your room must be right by the stove so that you don't freeze," Grandfather said. "But you can find mine too if you'll hunt for it." Heidi hopped across the broad room after Grandfather, who was on the other side, opening a door that led into a small cabinet where he had set up his bed. But then there was another door on beyond. Heidi pulled this quickly open, and then stood still in her amazement, for she was looking into a kind of a kitchen, the most enormous one she had ever dreamed of. There had been much work for Grandfather to do in this room. In fact, there was still a good deal to be done, for everywhere in the walls there were holes and wide cracks where the wind blew in, and this in spite of the fact that he had nailed so many of them shut with boards. It looked as though he had made a row of small cupboards all around the place. The old gentleman had also managed to fasten together the very ancient entrance door with wires and spikes so firmly that it could be tightly shut. And it was well that he could, for it looked out on the most ruined part of the house, where the rank weeds grew thickly, and where whole swarms of beetles and lizards lived. The new mansion pleased Heidi very much, and by the following day, when Peter came to see how they were getting along in it, she had examined all the nooks and corners so thoroughly that she felt quite at home there, and could show Peter everything. And she would not let him rest until he had seen every last one of the wonderful things which the new home contained. Heidi slept like a top in her corner by the stove, but when morning came, she would always imagine she was waking up on the mountain, and that she must open the door of the hut to find out at once why the fir trees were so quiet. She would think it must be because their boughs were weighed down by the deep, heavy snow that lay on them. So at first she had to look around her every morning for a long time before she could remember where she was. And the moment she did remember, she would feel a choking sensation, and her heart would be heavy because she was not in her home on the mountain pasture. And then she would hear her grandfather talking outside with Little Swan and Little Bear, and perhaps the goats would bleat loudly and happily, as if they were calling, "It's fine out here, Heidi. Come right away." Then she would decide that she was indeed at home after all. She would spring gaily out of bed and hurry at the first possible moment to the big goat stable. But after she had taken scarcely a step out of the house for several days, she finally said one morning, "I must be sure to go and call on Grandmother today. I must not leave her alone so long." Grandfather, however, did not agree to this. "Let's not talk about going today or tomorrow either, for that matter," he said. "The pasture land is buried under 6 feet of snow, and it's snowing this very minute. Peter himself is hardly strong enough to force his way through. Such a little creature as you, Heidi, would be snowed under the first thing, and so covered up that we wouldn't find you until spring. You just be patient until it freezes hard, and then you can walk on top of the crust as easy as anything." To sit and wait like that made Heidi very wretched. But before long her days were so filled up with work that one day flew by after another without her realizing the fact. Each morning, and again each afternoon, Heidi now spent at school, and she learned very rapidly whatever was given her to do. She hardly ever saw Peter in school, for he was absent a good deal. The teacher was a mild man, and had little to say about this except, "It seems as if Peter were not here again today. I wish he would come, for he needs to learn. But I suppose there's a lot of snow up where he is and can't get through." It was surprising, though, how often Peter could force his way through the snow and call on Heidi the moment school was out, along about dark. After a few days the sun came out again and shone down on the white earth. It would remain only a short while, and would then disappear behind the mountains very early, as if it did not care for what it saw nearly as much as in the summertime, when everything was green and in blossom. In the evening, on the other hand, the moon rose very bright and big to shine the whole night on the broad snowfields, and the next morning the whole mountain would glisten and gleam from top to bottom like a crystal. On one such morning, Peter jumped out of the window as he had done the day before, thinking to sink down into the deep snow. And then something happened he did not expect. He made his jump all right, but instead of sinking in, he took a bad tumble on the unexpectedly hard surface, and the next minute he was skidding a long way down the mountain, like a sled with no one to guide it. In great surprise, he finally managed to get his footing and stamped as hard as he could on the crust of snow, to make sure that there was no chance about what had just happened to him. And he quickly found out the truth. No matter how much he might stamp and hack with his heels, he could scarcely break out the smallest splinter of ice. The entire mountain was frozen as hard as a rock. Ha! That suited Peter to a T. He knew this was the way things had to be, so that Heidi could get up to his house. He hastily went back home, gulped down the milk which his mother had set down on the table, tucked a slice of bread into his pocket, and said, "I've got to go to school." "That's nice," his mother said agreeably. "Be a good boy and study hard." Peter crawled out of the window again, for the door was wedged in tight by the solid block of ice before it. He got out his little sled, sat on it, and started down the mountain like a shot. Faster, ever faster he flew like lightning. When he reached Dörfli in his flight and came to a road that leads on down to Mayenfeld, Peter held to his course without stopping, since he feared he might hurt himself badly and injure his sled if he should come to a sudden halt. So he stuck to the path until he reached a long strip of level ground, and there, of course, the sled stopped of its own accord. Then he climbed off and looked about him. The great force of his downward flight had carried him quite a way beyond Mayenfeld. He figured out that he was too late for school anyway, because the morning session had already begun, and it would take him more than an hour to climb back up the mountain. So he did not need to hurry about the return trip. Nor did he. He came into Dörfli just as Heidi had got back home from school and was sitting down to dinner with her grandfather. Peter went in to see them, and because he had one idea fixed in his mind so hard that he could not think of anything else, he started to speak right away. "She's got it at last!" Peter burst out the moment he had thrust his head in the door. "Got what? What has she got, General?" "That is a very warlike statement," said Nuncle. "The snow," Peter replied. "Oh, I know," cried out Heidi gaily, for she at once understood what Peter was trying to say. "He means I can go up to grandmother's now. But why didn't you come to school, you naughty? It was just as easy for you to slide down as it is for me to walk up." A little frown was on Heidi's face, and her voice was suddenly disapproving, for she did not think it was right to stay away from school when you could just as well go as not. "Went too far on my sled before I could stop," Peter answered, "and then it was too late." "In the army they call that deserting," Nuncle said, "and they punish deserters by pulling their ears. Did you know that?" In sudden terror, Peter tried to pull down his cap, for nobody in the world scared him quite as much as Meadow Nuncle. "And besides, a commander-in-chief like yourself ought to be twice as ashamed to run away," Nuncle went on. Peter hung his head and felt almost like crying. "What would you think," the old gentleman asked, "if your goats should go on strike, refuse to follow you any longer, and not do what they ought to do? What would you do in that case, General?" "Beat them," answered Peter shortly. "And suppose a boy acted like an unruly goat, and got beaten a little himself. What would you say to that?" I'd say it served him right." "Well then, let me tell you something, Colonel of Goats. The very next time you go flying past the schoolhouse on your sled during school hours, you come right in here to me, sir, and get what is coming to you." Then Peter knew very well what Meadow Nuncle meant when he said a runaway boy was like an unruly goat. He was a little frightened by the old man's words, and secretly he looked around in the corners to see if he could find any trace of the thing he used on his goats at such a time. But nowhere did there seem to be a rod, and the next words of Nuncle were very encouraging. "Come to dinner now and join in with us. Then Heidi can go up with you. You can bring her back this evening and find supper waiting for you here." This made Peter quite happy. His face twisted into a shy grin. He obeyed without delay and sat down beside Heidi. But the child had already had enough to eat and couldn't swallow another bite. She was so delighted at the thought of going to see grandmother. She pushed the big potato and the toasted cheese that had stood still on her plate over to Peter, whose dish had already been filled by Nuncle. So he had a regular mountain of food in front of him, and he was not backward in attacking it. Heidi ran to the cupboard and got the little cloak that Clara had sent her, and so she was ready, all wrapped warmly up in it, with its hood over her head, to start on the journey. She took her stand by Peter's chair, and no sooner had he thrust the last mouthful of food into his mouth than she said, "Come on now." So off they started. The very first thing, Peter had to hear all the latest news about Schweinli and Bärli. When they had been put in their new stall, neither of them would eat a blessed thing. The whole day they had just hung their heads and had not uttered a sound. And when she had asked Grandfather what was the matter, he told her that the goats felt exactly the same as she did in Frankfurt, because they had never been off the mountain pasture before in all their lives. And Heidi added, "You just can't imagine what a feeling that is, Peter." Peter did not have a thing to say until they had almost come to the end of their journey. He seemed to be so busy thinking of something or other that he had hardly heard what Heidi was chattering about. But just as they reached the hut, Peter stood still and said rather sulkily, "Well, then I'd sooner go to school than go to Nuncle and get what he said was coming to me." Heidi said she thought he was right, and did what she could to encourage him in his good resolution. They found Peter's mother alone in the living room, bent over her sewing. She said that Grandmother had to spend the day in bed because it was so cold, and then, too, she was not quite feeling herself. That was a new idea for Heidi. She always pictured Grandmother in her place by the spinning wheel in the corner. She ran straight into the bedroom. All wrapped up in the grey shawl, the old lady was lying on her narrow bed with its thin coverings. The moment Grandmother heard Heidi's light footsteps, she raised her head a little and said, "God be praised and thanked." All through the autumn, she had had a secret fear, about which she had told no one, a fear that she could not get rid of, especially if Heidi did not come to visit her for a while. Peter had told her about the strange gentleman who had come from Frankfurt and was forever walking up to the pasture to be with Heidi, and Grandmother, of course, could not be persuaded that the gentleman had not come to take Heidi away with him again. And even after the doctor had gone off alone, she was still afraid that somebody else would be sent from Frankfurt to carry the child away. Heidi ran to the sick woman's bed and asked with much sympathy, "Are you dreadfully sick, Grandmother?" "Oh my, no," the invalid said, soothingly, stroking Heidi's cheeks as she loved to do. "The cold has got into my old limbs a little, that's all." "Will you get well just the second it's warm again?" Heidi asked her eagerly. "I promise I will, and if God is willing, even before warm weather, for I want to get back to my spinning. I was thinking just this morning that I'd try getting up, but I'll be all right tomorrow anyway." Grandmother spoke as she did because she had noticed from the tone of Heidi's voice that the little child was worried, and her words did comfort her visitor, who had had quite a shock this first time that she had seen Grandmother sick abed. She looked at the old lady in some surprise and then said, In Frankfurt, they put on a shawl when they go out to walk. Did you think, Grandmother dear, that it was meant to go to bed in?" "You see, Heidi," the sick woman said, "I put the shawl around me in bed so as not to freeze, and I'm so glad to have it, because the bed covers are pretty thin." "But, Grandmother dear," Heidi went on to say, "your head lies downhill when it ought to lie the other way. That's a funny bed, I must say." "And don't you suppose I know it is, child? But you see, the pillow never was very thick, and I've been sleeping on it for so many years that I've made it pretty flat." Grandmother hunted around on her pillow to find a better place to rest her head, but without success. The old thing seemed as flat and hard as a board. "Oh," cried Heidi, "if I had only asked Clara when I was in Frankfurt, to let me bring my bed home with me. Why, it had 3 great fat pillows, one on top of the other, and I couldn't sleep, because my head was always sliding down to a flat place, and then I had to put it back up again so I could sleep right. Could you sleep on so many pillows, Grandmother?
Surely I could. That keeps you warm, and then you can breathe more easily when your head is high.
The old lady lifted her head from the pillow with some difficulty, as if to find a higher place for it.
But we won't talk about that any more, she said. I have so much to thank God for that the other sick ladies do not have. There are the nice rolls that come every day, and there's this fine warm shawl, and then besides, there's you to come and see me. I wonder if you'll read something to me again, Heidi?
Heidi ran out of the room, and soon came back with the old hymn book. Then she sought out one beautiful song after another, for by this time she knew them all well and enjoyed going through them once again. It had been many days since she had heard all these verses of which she was so fond. Grandmother lay beside her with folded hands, and there was now a happy smile on her face, which had at first looked so troubled. She seemed to think that some great good fortune had happened to her. Suddenly Heidi stopped reading. "Grandmother, are you well again?" she asked.
You have done me good, Heidi. I've been getting better all the time you've been reading to me. Finish the hymn, dear.
The child went on to the very end of the song, and when she was reading the last words, which speak of the light God pours into the sad eyes of men, Grandmother recited them with her, and said them over yet again afterward. A look of joy came into her face. Heidi was happy to watch the change come in Grandmother's eyes. She suddenly remembered how the sun shone the day she returned home, and she cried out happily, "Oh, oh, Grandmother, I've already learned how one feels when he's going back home." There was no answer, at least not in words, but Heidi could tell the old lady had understood perfectly what she said, for the look that she so loved to see stayed in Grandmother's face. After a short silence, the child said again, "Now it's growing dark, and I must go down to the hamlet, but I am glad you are so much better." Grandmother took Heidi's hand in hers and held it fast.
"Yes, I'm happy again," she smiled. "Even if I must keep to my bed, I'm content. You see, until one has been through it himself, nobody knows how miserable it is to have to lie for days and days abed, and all alone. Never to hear a word from another's lips, never to see a single ray of light. Then it is that such gloomy thoughts pop into your head, and you often feel as if the light of day would never come again, and as if you could not stand it another minute. But when you hear such words of promise as you have read to me, then it's as if a light shines into your heart, and all the darkness is driven away."
Grandmother drew her hand away. Heidi said good night to her and ran back to the other room. She made Peter scramble out after her through the little window as fast as he could, for it was now growing late. But although it was evening, the moon outside was up in the sky, and it shone as brightly on the white snow as if a new day were dawning. Peter got his sled ready, sat down on the front part of it with Heidi close behind, and they shot off down the mountain pasture, quite as if they were 2 birds hurtling through the air. Later on that night, when Heidi was lying behind the stove on her fine high couch of hay, she thought about Grandmother again. She remembered how uncomfortable her head had been on its hard pillow. She heard again all that had been said, and saw the happy light the words of the hymn had kindled in the old face. And she could not help thinking that if Grandmother heard the words every day, then she would always feel more cheerful. But Heidi knew that a whole week, and perhaps 2, must now pass by before she could go up for another visit. What could be done? It seemed so sad to Heidi that she kept thinking harder and harder how it might be so arranged that Grandmother could hear her hymns every day. The way of help suddenly occurred to her, and she was so happily excited about it that it seemed as if she could not wait until daylight came so that she could carry out her plan. All at once she sat up straight in bed. Because she had been so busy thinking, she had forgotten to say her evening prayer to the dear God, and she did not want to let that slip by even once, no matter what happened. When she ended her prayer for herself and for grandfather and grandmother, she fell back on her soft hay and slept soundly and peacefully until broad daylight. Chapter 19. The Winter Continues. Next day, Peter came down to school at just the right time. He brought his dinner with him in his bag, for that was what all the pupils did except those that lived in the village. When the Dörfli children went home at noon, then the others who lived at a distance sat down on the classroom desks, planted their feet firmly on the seats in front of them, spread out on their knees the food that they had brought, and proceeded to eat. They had until 1 o'clock for play, and then school began again. When Peter had finished his school day, he went the moment it was over across to Nuncle's to pay a visit to Heidi. This day, when after school he had gone to Nuncle's and entered the big living room, Heidi ran to meet him, for he was just the one whom she had been waiting for. "Peter, I've got something to tell you," she called to him. "Out with it," he said. "You've got to learn to read right away." "Haven't I been doing it?" demanded Peter. "Oh, sort of, Peter, but I don't mean that kind of reading," Heidi said excitedly. "I mean so that you can read by yourself." "No use," the boy answered. "Nonsense. Nobody believes you can't learn, and I don't either," Heidi said firmly. "Grandmamma in Frankfurt knew it wasn't true, and she told me so." Peter was greatly astonished at this news. "I'll teach you to read if you'll let me." "I know how to do it fine," Heidi went on to say. "You just have to learn first from me, and then afterward you can read a hymn or two every day to grandmother." "Betcha I can't. There's no sense in it," growled Peter. The way that Peter just wouldn't try to do anything that was good and right when she wanted him to so much made Heidi very angry. Her eyes flashed as she stood in front of the boy and said in a threatening manner, "All right, then. I'll tell you fast enough what's going to happen if you get sulky and won't learn. Didn't I hear your mother herself tell you twice that you'd have to go to Frankfurt and learn all sorts of things that you didn't want to? And I guess I've seen the school that they go to, the bad boys." "Ah, how did you ever see that?" "Well, I did. When we were driving, Clara showed me the great big house, and they don't stop going there when they're only boys, but they keep on going, even after they've grown to be tall, great men. I've seen them myself, and don't you go thinking that they only have one teacher the way we have, and a nice teacher, too. No, sir. Whole rows of them are always walking into the house, ever so many of them together, and they're all dressed in black, like when they go to church, and they have black hats on their heads as tall as that." Heidi showed the size of the hats by holding out her hand quite a way up from the floor. A shiver ran up Peter's back and then down again. "And then you have got to go in there among all those teachers," Heidi went on to say eagerly. "And when it comes your turn, you can't read anything at all and make mistakes in spelling. Then you just wait and see how those teachers will laugh at you, and they say it's even worse than when Tinette laughs at you. And you ought to see how it feels when she gets started." "Oh, I'll learn then," Peter said, half whining and half angry. Heidi grew soft and gentle at once. "Now you're a nice boy," she said happily. "We'll begin this minute." She hurried Peter over to the table and got out all the necessary tools. In the big bundle that Clara had sent, there was a small book that pleased Heidi immensely. When she had been thinking things over in bed the night before, it suddenly occurred to her that she might use this book to teach Peter out of. It was an ABC book with rhymes. Then they both sat down at the table, their heads bent over the little book, and the lesson hour began. Peter was made to spell out the first rhyme again and again, for Heidi wished him to know the sentence nicely and without any stumbling. At last, however, she said to him, "You don't know it still, but I'll read it over to you several times. After you know how it runs, then you can spell it out better." And Heidi read, "If in ABC you fail, they will send you off to jail."
"I won't either," said
Peter sulkily. "Won't what?" Heidi asked him.
"Won't go to jail,"
the boy answered. "Then you see to it that you know those 3 letters, and they won't send you there," Heidi told him. At that, Peter again set to work and repeated the 3 letters steadily until Heidi said, "Now you know the first 3. But because she had seen what an effect the rhyme made on Peter, she decided to read ahead a little for the lessons that were to follow. "You wait, and I'll read you the other rhymes," she continued. "Then you'll see what's going to come next." And then she began to read in a clear and distinct voice. "D-E-F-G, you now must say, or you'll have bad luck all the day. If you forget H-I-J-K, the same bad luck will come to stay. Now, if at L and M you stick, you'll pay a fine and then feel sick. There's something fine that waits for you when you've learned N, O, P, and Q. And if at R-S-T you halt, whatever happens is your fault." Here Heidi stopped a while, for Peter had become still as a mouse, and she had to see what was the matter. All the threats and secret things that the rhyme spoke of had taken such hold on his imagination that he could not move a muscle. He was staring at Heidi with eyes full of fear. That touched Heidi's tender heart, and she said to soothe him, "Don't be afraid, Peter. If you'll only come in every afternoon and learn as well as you have today, then after a while you'll know all the letters by heart, and then nothing bad will happen to you. But you'll have to come every day now, and not play hooky as you do in school. Even if it snows, it won't do you any harm." Peter promised to be good, for fear had made him quite tame and obedient. Then he started for home. In the days that followed, he did exactly what Heidi told him to, and every afternoon he studied the other letters of the alphabet so eagerly that he soon knew the rhymes by heart. Grandfather would often sit in the living room and listen to the lessons while he contentedly smoked his pipe. But do what he would, he could not keep the corners of his mouth from twitching sometimes. He had such a great desire to laugh. As a reward for his great struggles, Peter was usually asked to stay for supper with them, and he always felt that this more than paid him for the awful efforts that he had to make to learn the day's rhyme. So the winter days passed quickly by. Peter was regular in his attendance, and soon began to make real progress with his letters. His worst moments were when he was fighting with his rhymes. Finally, they got as far as the letter U. When Heidi read him this rhyme, he grew sulky and growled. "If you mix up your U and V, you'll go where you don't want to be."
"I'll bet they couldn't make me,"
he muttered. But he learned his rhymes thoroughly just the same, and it looked as if he really did believe someone might secretly take him by the collar and carry him off to the bad place, where he did not want to go one little bit. On the following afternoon, Heidi read, "Whate'er you do, don't stick at W, or here's the stick that's sure to trouble you." Then Peter looked around him and said in triumph,
There isn't any stick."
"Oh, isn't there?" Heidi asked. "Don't you know what Grandfather keeps in his big chest? It's a stick as big around as my arm almost, and when he takes that out, you'll have to say, 'There's the stick that's sure to trouble me.'" Peter was well acquainted with the big hazel cane that Grandfather often carried when he went on a long tramp, so he immediately bent over his letter W and did his best to learn it. Next day after that he read, "If you the letter X forget,
Your place at the table won't be set." Peter looked questioningly in the direction of the cupboard where the bread and cheese were kept, and he demanded crossly, "Did I ever say that I'd forget the letter X?" "That's good. And now, as you're not going to forget X, we can learn the next letter right away," Heidi proposed. "Then tomorrow we'll have only one letter left to learn." Peter did not see the sense of hurrying, but Heidi had already begun to read. "If you can't learn the letter Y, we'll scorn and shame you till you cry." When he heard this rhyme, there before Peter's eyes stood all the teachers in Frankfurt, with their tall black hats on their heads, and scorn and shame for him written in their faces. So he at once tackled Y, and did not let go of it until he knew it so well that he could close his eyes and still tell how it looked. On the following day, when he got to Heidi's house, Peter was feeling a trifle puffed up, for you see there was only one letter left for him to work at. Heidi read him the rhyme. "Send the bad boy who does not know Z to Timbuktu across the sea." Peter said sneeringly, "I don't suppose anybody knows where that place is." "They do too, Peter," Heidi answered confidently. "My grandfather knows all about it. Just wait a minute, and I'll ask him right away where Timbuktu is. He's only at the pastor's house." Heidi had already jumped to her feet and was walking toward the door. Peter was badly scared. "Wait, won't you?" he howled in great alarm, for in his imagination he saw Meadownunkle and the pastor coming in, and he almost felt them seize him and start to bundle him straight off to Timbuktu, since he couldn't remember what the name of Z was. His cry of alarm halted Heidi before she reached the door. "Why, what's the matter?" she asked in amazement. "Nothing's the matter," Peter stammered. "Come back and I'll learn it honest." But Heidi really wanted to know for her own information where Timbuktu was, and so was going to ask her grandfather about it. But Peter screamed at her so that she gave up her plan and came back. He had to work hard, however, to pay her back for her kindness. She not only made him repeat the letter Z over and over until it stuck fast in his mind so he could never forget it, but she took up the subject of syllables. And on that afternoon, Peter learned so much that he took a great step forward. In this manner the lessons went on day after day. The snow had grown soft again, and lately there had not been 24 hours without a fresh fall of snow, so for almost 3 weeks Heidi had been unable to go up to grandmother's. That made her all the more eager to get Peter to the point where he could take her place in reading the hymns. And so it came about that one evening Peter returned from Heidi's and ran into the sitting room of his mother's house, saying, "I can do it." "What can you do, Peterly?" his mother asked. "Read," he answered. "Why, is that possible? Do you hear what he is saying, grandmother?" Brigida called. Yes, the old lady had heard Peter's boast, and was dumb with amazement, wondering how it had all happened. "Heidi said I had to read a hymn to you," Peter went on to report. His mother ran to take the book from its shelf, and grandmother was pleased, because she had not heard the good words read for a long time. Peter sat down at the table and began to read, while his mother sat down beside him to listen. At the end of each verse she said in much surprise, "Who would have thought it possible?" And grandmother found nothing to add to Brigida's words, but she listened with great interest as Peter read to her one verse after another. The day after he had shown what he could do with the hymn book, it happened that Peter's class in school had a reading lesson. When it came to Peter's turn, the teacher said, "Peter, must I again pass you by as generally I do, or do you wish once more to try to blunder through a line?" The boy's only answer was to read 3 lines, one right after the other without stopping. The teacher laid down his book. He stared at his pupil in silent amazement, as if he had never seen his like. At last he said, "Peter, a miracle has happened to you. Although I almost worked my head off to teach you, you were never able to get even the alphabet straight. And now, the moment I give you up as a bad job, much as I hate to do so, you come right out with a knowledge not alone of spelling, but of reading correctly and clearly. Who in these days can perform such miracles?"
"Heidi," Peter answered. Much taken aback by this simple remark of Peter's, the teacher looked at Heidi, but she was sitting in her place, looking so innocent that there seemed to be nothing unusual about her. So the teacher went on to say,
"I've noticed other changes in you, Peter. You used to stay away from school a week at a time. Yes, several weeks even. And now you're never absent. Who has brought about in you this great change for the better?"
"Nuncle," was the answer. The poor schoolmaster kept getting more surprised than ever. He looked from Peter to Heidi, and from Heidi back to Peter.
"Let us try it once more," he said then, in order to make sure.
And again the boy had to show his knowledge by reading the next 3 lines. But he got through it all right. He had learned to read. The moment school was over, the teacher hastened to the pastor's house to tell him what had happened and how much good Nuncle and Heidi were doing in the village. Peter now read a hymn at home every evening. In so far he obeyed Heidi, but not a step farther, for he never read a second hymn, and grandmother never asked him to. His mother Brigida never ceased to wonder that Peter had learned so well, and many an evening, after the reading was over and the boy was in bed, she would say to grandmother, "We just can't be happy enough that Peter has learned to read in spite of everything. Now there's no telling what he may do."
"Oh, yes, it's nice of him to have learned. But just the same, I shall be glad when the dear God sends his spring weather to us again, so that Heidi could come and see us. I always feel different about a hymn when she is reading it. There seems to be something left out when Peter is reading a verse, and I'm always hunting to see what it is. And then I lose the thought of a hymn, and it doesn't go straight to my heart, the way it does when I'm listening to Heidi's words." One reason for grandmother's trouble was that Peter fixed the hymns up a little, so they would not be too hard for him. When he saw a word coming that looked too long or too difficult, he simply left it out. He thought it would not really matter to grandmother whether there were 3 or 4 words more or less in a line or not. There were enough words left anyway. So it came about that there were not many nouns left in a hymn when Peter got to reading it. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Heidi. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future stories, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.